So happy to have you on the Psychology Podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm really happy to be here, Daniel.
In order to not butcher your introduction, could you tell the world who you are?
I am Brian Lowery. I'm a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and also a podcaster. I have a podcast as well, Know What You See, and soon to be author. I have a book coming out in March.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. So one of the first questions that I like to ask right off the beginning is, what's a good starting point to discover how you became the person that you are today? Where do we start?
We can start wherever you like. I'm open. I was raised in Chicago, so I think like a lot of people, my childhood influenced what I was interested in. So that's I guess a potential starting point.
Amazing, amazing. If you would write an autobiography and you would name that chapter of your life before we dive into it, any idea what you would call it? Or is that food for thought for later?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I could have an uninteresting title, something like Beginnings.
Love it. What did you grow up, Brian? What did you grow up?
I grew up in Chicago, mostly on the south side of Chicago, but I moved around quite a bit when I was a kid.
What was it like to grow up in Chicago?
It was. I grew up in Chicago in the late '80s, early '90s, I guess, '80s and '90s, and it was. I don't know if you know what the United States was like in the '80s and '90s, but it was. What would I say? It was a different time than now. Is what I would say. It was a different time.
Very much different. What was the first thought that was coming to your mind when you're making the comparison between how things are now and how they have been in the 80s and 90s? Outside of the fact that Chicago was winning in basketball, of course.
Yeah, that was a good time for sports in Chicago. I think that kids probably had more freedom then, so you could just go out and be out, and it wasn't as if you could be tracked. There were no cell phones. Parents were used to kids being outside and on their own with their friends. There was a lot more of that, and honestly, despite what people think, it's way safer now than it was then. So there was more danger, but I don't know. It felt safer. It felt safe for the most part, but just being in and around the city on the bike and out all day doing what kids do, just a different time.
What was the first sign that you grew up to be a psychologist?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing that happened was visiting my mom's school. So my mom was a school teacher in Chicago. She taught in Chicago public schools. She taught grammar school, so fourth grade. And she taught, I believe the school was on the west side. The school she taught, the west side of Chicago. And it was a low income neighborhood, and the schools weren't great. And, the parents were stressed, so the kids were stressed. So it was just a different situation. And when I visited her, it was just clear to me that, like I went to a kindergarten class, and they're 4 and 5 year old kids, whatever, young kids, and they're just doing what young kids do, playing, sitting on rugs, whatever. But it occurred to me that given their life circumstances, their prospects for the future were not as bright as other people I knew or the kids I had seen. And that was striking to me at the time, just a recognition of how much of our lives are dictated by forces outside of our control.
Any particular story that comes to mind where you made this discovery? Because one of my mentors, Jeffrey Kotler, he wrote like, I think 150 books about psychotherapy. It's a case we made, he's the best therapist in the world. And he said, like, great psychologists and therapists, it's almost an involuntary element that leads up to them becoming who they are, like a form of event or something that leads to this early specialization in their craftsmanship? Or do you know what I'm trying to allude to?
Yeah.
Was there
Yeah.
anything where you said like, I'm noticing something maybe that bothered you more than others, something that you noticed that was
Yeah. I
invisible
mean,
to others?
yeah. So, well, like I said, I moved around quite a bit, but I moved schools. So I went to a lot of different kinds of schools in Chicago. And I went to Catholic schools that were primarily white. I went to public school that was almost completely Black. I went to two different high schools, one that was very mixed and grade school, and one that I graduated from, which was huge. I think there were 800 people in my graduating class, a little bit less than that. And it was diverse, except that you couldn't see it in the school because of I didn't, my classes, I think I might have been the only Black kid in most of my academic classes because of the kind of the track I was in. And so what was striking to me about that is seeing that the differences among the places I had been and expectations people had of others, and the effect that would have on people's life chances. Like I felt like I saw that early, mostly because of the movement I had across kind of demographic and socioeconomic lines. And that just created a curiosity in me about how the world was organized and why it was organized that way, and how we treated each other, and how we, constrain or open possibilities for other people.
That is a very interesting point that you made. Do you remember when that dissociation happened for you in regards to the story that was imposed upon you in regards to who you are and what your potential trajectory was, in regards to finding a gap in between and discovering the freedom of like, hey, I am the own designer of my identity in a way? Because just from my personal sense, like I remember I was very bad at school, Brian, very bad. I got kicked off from 3 schools. And every time that happened, like when people told me like, you should start using with your hands because that hand of yours isn't good enough, I believed them to the degree of it, like, okay, like that's my identity in a way. So I don't need to, for example, try certain things because they were outside of the possibilities that I could attempt. And I was wondering like how that was for you in regards to the story that you believed about yourself, or the identity that you bought into because of the circumstances that you grew up in particular in regards to the school. That was a very long question, but maybe you can diffuse it for me.
So for me, since I'd been in different situations, I'd seen myself in different ways, right? So I think the way you experience yourself is in large part a function of how the people around experience you and treat you, right? So the only way you can see yourself is through a mirror, basically. You have no direct ability to see. You can't see yourself directly. You can only see it through reflections, in essence. And moving around different places, people saw different things in me and treated me in different ways because of the spaces I was in. I mean, I always showed up as a young Black person, but being in different contexts changes how people respond to that. And for that reason, when people engage with me as if I was this one thing, like people might have thought like I was a troublemaker. It turns out I was not a troublemaker, but people could have seen me in that way. It didn't necessarily constrain me as much as it could have, because I'd had such a diversity of experiences, meaning that in some situations people think you're really smart, and you walk into a room and everybody thinks you're an idiot. Like it's much harder to walk in that room if everyone in your life thinks you're an idiot, and then this room thinks you're an idiot too. Then it's hard to say like, maybe that's true, maybe that's what I am. But if you live a life where outside of that room people are not treating you that way, it's easier to resist that version of yourself. And I guess I would say that's something that's akin to how my life has been, right? I've been in, like right now, I'm a professor at Stanford. And in that context, people engage with me in a certain way. right? There's a certain type of deference that that role produces. But when I'm walking down the street in a place where people don't know me, they don't know I'm a professor. Like I'm just a Black man, right? And so if I walk into a place and people treat me in a way that's consistent with their ideas of what a Black man is, it's frustrating, but it has less impact on me, maybe because on these other contexts, I'm a Stanford professor. And so I think the moving around created more possibilities in terms of how I understood myself and what I was and what I could be, than what I would have had if I stayed in one context, and only had seen myself through the eyes of people in that singular context. So I think my in that sense, my identity is complex because I have a sense of how people look at me and what they see. And sometimes I know how discrepant that is from the life I live. So I'll give you an example. Let me make this concrete. So the other day, I was going to the airport, and I need an Uber driver came to pick me up. Okay, and I'm in sweats and a t-shirt or something. I'm going to get on the flight, and it's relaxed. And he picks me up at my house, and then we're driving away. We get close to the airport, and he asked me, "Is that your house?" And I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Well, it looks empty. Do you rent it out?" I was like, "No, it's my home." And it becomes clear that he's trying to, like, he sees me and he sees how I'm dressed and he sees the home I'm just leaving, and he's trying to resolve in his mind the discrepancy between who I appear to be and the place I live. And that was like that was fine, whatever. But what that highlights is that what he saw was incompatible with the house I lived in. So if he didn't see the home I lived in, there would have been nothing for him to explain. He would have seen me in a way that was very discrepant from the way I live, who I am in my day-to-day life, and thought that he knew me, right? What he had to resolve was not who I was, but the discrepancy between what I appeared to him to be and the house I left, which says, like, when I'm walking around, and if I assume most people are like him, they're assuming I'm someone that I'm not, right? They don't see me. And that's a recognition I understand. I mean, that's something I understand about my life, that people frequently don't see me. Like, they're not going to look at me, and they would just not be able to make sense of the life I live.
What does that feel like because I think at this point, I mean, at what you do, you're undoubtedly one of the best in the world. Like there's like, one of the reasons why I started this podcast in English is because when I studied psychology, I had ambitions about one day making it to the top. And that was, for me, it was Stanford. That was for me like the MBA of psychology, in a way, where all the cool professors are, in a way. So now that you are there, what kind of feelings does this give you, that maybe the world is in many circumstances blind to your greatness?
It's a good question. I would say it doesn't bother me, but that's not true. But I think it doesn't bother me for the reasons people might assume. I don't, how do I say this? I am appreciative of where I am in life. Like, I get that being a professor at Stanford has a lot of benefits associated with it, like many benefits associated with it. But I still don't think of myself primarily as a Stanford professor, right? I don't think of myself as someone who has a PhD. I just think of myself, and this, I think, how most people day to day think of themselves. I just think of myself as just me, my experiences. And then sometimes I'm surprised where I am in life. I'm like, how did this happen? Like, here I am in this situation at Stanford, and the people are engaging with me this way, and these opportunities are coming in. It's almost like I don't know how it happened. It just kind of worked out that way. That's how it feels often. So I'm not the kind of person who's like, I'm a professor at Stanford. People should recognize and respect that. I don't have that. I mean, if I wasn't a professor at Stanford, I would still be me. I would have still had all the potential that I have, whatever that is. I still would have been capable of what I'm capable of now. And it wouldn't have been, in some sense, any worse to have people see me in a diminished way if I had any other job. Like, the way it feels mostly is acceptance of the nature of the world. This is how it works. I don't like it, but it's how it works. And so it's, a degree of acceptance and thought about how to engage with it in a productive way for me. So what does it mean to, like, how do I live my life in a way that is true to who I am across different contexts and engages with other people's visions of me in a way that I feel comfortable with. Right. So if I'm walking down the street and someone's engaging me, or if I'm talking to me in a shop, what do I want from them, and how do I engage with them in a way that produces that kind of interaction for me? And that's not, just so you know, that's not always easy, right? So there was a time when I was in grad school, I was getting my PhD, and I was playing basketball, and I had some allergic reaction to something on the court on the basketball, and my eye started swelling shut from this reaction. And when I was in high school, I had anaphylactic shock once when I was in high school and had to go to the hospital. So I was nervous. Like, I'm in grad school, my eye is starting to swell. I'm nervous that this is gonna, spiral out of control. So I go to the emergency room. And keep in mind, I was playing basketball, so I had on a t-shirt and I had put on some sweats. But I'm like, a little, not dirty, but just like, I'd been out playing sports in the gym at the university. And so I go to the emergency room on the campus, right? So the university has a hospital. And I'm sitting and waiting, trying to stay calm, because when you get excited or nervous, this reaction increases. So I finally get into the triage room with the nurse, and she asks me what's wrong. And before I can answer, some other guy, like a, I don't know, middle-aged man at the time in a suit, who's disheveled, who to me looks clearly inebriated, says he has chest pain. And she says, it doesn't matter what your issue is, I have to see him first. And so I hesitate for a moment, and I get up and let her see him. And I come back in the room and I say, she says, what happened? I was like, I'm having an allergic reaction. I'm afraid I could end up, this could worsen. I could end up having anaphylactic shock. And she's clearly shaken, because the reality is she should have triaged me first, because that's a serious issue. And she didn't, because it was clear she had assumed I'd been in a fight. Right. That like, because my eye is swelling, I have on these clothes, I'm this like youngish Black guy at the time, like I'm, in my mid-20s. And so I tell the story to my advisor, to my PhD advisor, and he says, why didn't you tell her you're getting a PhD at the university? And I said something like, why should I have to tell someone that what I'm doing to get the dignity that any human being deserves? Like, I don't understand why I should have to do that. And this has come up, it's come up a few times in my life, where it's like, I could let people know these other things that I have, or these other identities, and I might be treated differently, and I have to make a decision about what to do with that. And I don't always know what the right answer to that is. So when I think about being in the world and having these identities that in other people's minds are very discrepant, right? Like, Black man, especially when I was younger, it was worse, but early 20s, 30s Black man with a PhD who's a professor at Stanford. Sometimes I told people and they didn't believe me. I would tell people my job and they thought I was making it up. I don't know why anybody would make that up, like decide that that's the lie they're going to tell. I would tell some more fantastical lie than that, I guess. But this is not, like, there are clear incompatibilities between different aspects of people's understanding of who I am or who I should be. And the question for me always is, how do I engage with that? Like when those choices are presented to me in a clear way, in some sense, I have to decide who I want to be in that moment to those people. And I have a clear sense of that as I go through the world, that my identities for a lot of people don't coexist comfortably. And so I have to decide for them and for me who I'm going to be with them.
Thank you for sharing that interesting story with me. If you could travel back in time and put your hand on the shoulder of the cab driver who picked you up in front of the house and who couldn't believe that it was yours because his belief system of what was probable for you didn't match the reality, and you could give him short advice, what would you tell him? Or what would you give him in regards? You can also give him something else.
It's a good question. I would probably tell him something like, it's more fun to discover who someone is than to assume, you know.
I love that. Was there a force of good in your upbringing who helped you to preserve the integrity of your character in spite of residual injustices that you encountered? Maybe a mentor, a parent, or somebody who helped you to pick the high road in a way. Because one of the things that I'm always interested in when I talk to someone new is, what do they do with the cards that were dealt to them? Because I just feel that particularly in circumstances where something bad happens to somebody, there's always the opportunity of going down, of giving into resentment, and maybe even losing faith in the brotherhood of man and working against it in order to take vengeance against it. Somebody who helped you to protect your light in a way.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good question. I think there's a lot of people who did that for me, but I wouldn't, it's hard to point to one person and say, this is the person who was like there consistently in this way. I think a lot of people did that for me. Like I would say I've always been really curious, and people who engaged with me on that from the time I was a kid and until even today, I feel like helped me maintain my sense of self, is what I would say. Help me have some consistency in the way I approach the world. I think over time, I wouldn't say there's no cynicism on my part, because I guess I'm that kind of, I don't know if there's this cliche or something about being a cynic. It's like a frustrated idealist. I feel like I'm that way sometimes, that the world should be so much better than it is. And sometimes it's just frustrating. But in all of that, and I think for me, maintain a deep curiosity about how things are, why things are the way they are, and how people make sense of themselves and their lives. And that curiosity, I think, is empathy for just the struggle of being a human being, right? So I think that's, if anything, that I think that people that help me engage with that curiosity, who share that curiosity with me, help me maintain my sense of self, in part because it helps me be more interested in humanity than resentful about it.
Who's Brian if he's stripped of all his identity?
No one. That's all there is. It's just an onion at the core. There is no core, right? All there is this is kind of my belief. All there is who who you are with the people around you. Like I don't know if there's any core beyond that.
Do you believe that identity is like one of the emphasis that I learned from your work, and in the brief time that I could study it, was that you made an emphasis that identity is always ensues out of the relationship we have with other people. Mm-hmm. But do you believe that we are therefore born as blank papers?
No, I believe that there's I don't believe like in we're not a blank slate when we're born. I mean, I believe in genetics and predispositions, but the meaning that we ascribe to the way we engage with the world and our sense of what that means, like that's what we're talking about when we talk about identity. Who someone is not their predispositions. It's the sense you make of that person and the sense they make of themselves. And that sense is completely exists in relationships. And so I don't think people are born blank slates. If what people mean is that there is an infinite number of ways that they might be in the world. There are no constraints. That's not true. Definitively, that's not true. At the same time, when we talk about selves, that's not what we're talking about, I don't think. We're talking about is the meaning that we and other people make of the way we engage in the world, not the pure biology or temperament that comes from that. That's not what people are talking about, I don't think. And so when you ask who am I, what I think about there is like the meaning that I ascribe to the way I engage in the world, like who I think I am is that, and that comes in relationships.
Mm-hmm. You used the word meaning.
Mm-hmm.
I find that very interesting. I built a feature recently for the university that I built where people can track how good their life, that day was, basically. And I gave them different parameters. And now one of them was meaning. And I defined it as something that it's that kind of feeling that you have when you were the right person at the right time, surrounded by the right kind of people. It's like a sense of you following your path in a way. And I wanted to hear your take on it in regards to if identity ensues of our relationships. Do you not believe that there's like a personal path that we all have? Is the fact that Brian exists an accident, or do you feel that you were always meant to come out the way that you would have been Brian, no matter where in the world you would have been born?
Oh no, I don't believe that. No. I don't think I would have been the same no matter where I was born, no.
So you don't believe that at your core there's something constant, something that is you in its most purest sense. And now I don't have the.
So you asked me. I think you asked me about a soul. Or you asked me, do I believe in souls? That's what it sounds. That's it.
In a way, it's because if you are just the product, or not just the product of the roles you collect over your lifetime or your history, it's basically against the idea that there was always, for example, Carl Jung believed in the path of individuation, the idea that we always are on the path to becoming who we already are, in a way. And I feel that belief of like, okay, the sculpture is already there. We're just being shaped by external forces unless there's nothing left to take off, is contrary to what I've learned from you in a way. And I found that very interesting to what conclusion you came in that regard.
Yeah, so I think if you pick someone up and you put them in a completely different context, they will be a different person. So I don't believe that there's some immutable core of who you are that would be there independent of your life experiences and the people in your life. No, I don't believe that. Like I think, for example, like I'm just thinking in terms, instead of thinking place, think time. So if you lived in, I don't know, the Russian steppe, during a time of, I don't know, call it the 1200s, like aggression and anger, and the way you manage that and what that meant about who you were would be very different than if you're born in, I don't know, in Europe or in the United States today. Like you could be, the temperament could be the same, but the meaning that would ascribe to that, who you would be, who you would think you were, would be very different. Like I just don't. I mean, we make sense of ourselves in the contexts in which we exist. There's no way to think about someone that's decontextualized. Like there's a core absent the context. I don't know what that means. Like the context makes you a person. There is no person without context, without social context. So to ask the question of like, who would you be if you stripped all these things away? Like you stripped away all the social context, all the relationships, all the expectations, all the responsibilities that I carry and bear, that we all carry and bear, there would be no person.
Interesting. In your upbringing, or maybe early chapters of your life, what do you feel was the moment where you migrated from being a boy towards being a man?
I think I would probably say that happened primarily in a way that I can see clearly anyway in graduate school. Like for me, graduate school was a deeply transformative experience. I think it was maybe the first time I had any degree of clarity about both who I was and who I wanted to become, and the gap between those two things. And the first time that I, like, in a very conscious way, put in significant work to try to traverse that gap. And that to me is like I think that was the moment of some sort of deeper coming to be, or like an understanding of like, I guess if you think of it as like becoming a man or like maturation, like that would be the place I'd point to.
How did you make this discovery, in a way? Because it's the discovery of, like, part of the reason why I founded the school that I told you when we were off air was because the university that I went to did not help me at all to discover who I wanted to be in the world. And retrospectively, I felt that that was its primary duty, to help me in that journey, in a way. So the fact that you had this is very intriguing to me. Could you maybe share the story of how you discovered or won this clarity for your bride?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you said earlier you didn't like school or didn't do well in school. I did not like school. I would say I probably still don't like school very much. I know, which is strange because I'm a professor now. I recognize that, but it's true. Like I never liked school. I didn't like the way classes were managed. I didn't like. I just don't like the kind of constraint that's necessary to teach a group of people a topic. I just don't do well in that kind of situation. In those kind of settings, I just don't respond that well to them. And so I did well in school, though I didn't like it, but I never really thought of myself as doing a PhD, and I'd never been in the kind of setting that a good PhD program sets, where it's, if it's done well, the world opens to you and you are awed by the vastness of your ignorance. And you are, if you're curious, compelled to dive into that. And so I had that experience. I think if you go to get a PhD in the right kind of program, I think that is the experience that people should have. On top of that, however, I didn't understand the cultural context of the PhD programs, meaning that it's not like PhD programs and the faculty at at major universities are filled with average people. And I mean average, I don't mean intelligence or anything like that. I mean just it's not like from people from all walks of life. It's often people who have some shared cultural reference or some shared experiences that I did not have. And so not only was I confronted with the immense amount of knowledge in the area that I need to try to at least begin to master, have some understanding of, I also didn't understand the cultural context I was in. And so at the time, it was both a recognition that success in the discipline in my area of study would also require to some degree of facility in the culture in which that discipline was practiced. Like I was going to live in these worlds that I didn't understand. Like I was going to live in around academics, or I was going to live around in university spaces, and I needed to understand those spaces. And so I think that was kind of like just the thing that hit me, that I saw and understood. And there I feel like my advisor in graduate school, I don't think I don't think he was purposely trying to help me with that, but I think he did a lot. So the amount of I wouldn't say change exactly, but surely that's true. I did change, but the amount of growth, the amount of new possibilities and ways of thinking and seeing the world that I took on during that period of my life was vast.
In the first part of our interview, we talked a little bit about your upbringing and in the city, Chicago, if I remember it correctly. Now you're in Stanford. Those are two very different worlds. I remember the first time where I dreamed of going there, and I looked up what it costs to actually study there. And then I was like, maybe I just build a university myself.
It might be cheaper.
That might be cheaper, or just maybe teach there at some point. It's a celebrity teacher, because I couldn't believe like how that would be possible in a way. Like, how did this chapter of your life, Stanford, came about, if I may ask?
Yeah. So what's funny is I applied to grad school to go to Stanford graduate school, and actually I was accepted, and I decided not to go. I didn't go to Stanford for my PhD, and in part it was because the place felt. This wasn't the only reason, but the part of the reason was the place felt foreign to me when I visited. So when you apply to PhD programs, you get accepted, they generally fly you out to visit and meet with the faculty and meet with students and see the campus, so you can get a sense of this is the place you want to go or not. Because people that get into some place like Stanford, they get into other schools too. So their schools are now trying to, in essence, recruit you for people who don't know how the academic kind of market works. And then after you've visited a number of schools, you make a decision about where you want to go. And I don't know if you have you been on Stanford's campus now? Have you visited?
I have never been to America, sadly.
Oh, okay, that's right. I think you might have told me that. So Stanford. So when we think about, to give you a sense, colleges, most people think about is Gothic architecture. So you think about East Coast. You probably, maybe people have seen like pictures of buildings at Harvard, or if you watch movies and TV shows, what the architecture looks like is mostly like European, right? Like that's really what they have in like medieval kind of Gothic architecture is what they have in mind when we think of universities. Stanford is not like that at all. Stanford is like Spanish Mission. So it's like red tiled roofs, beige facades, light beige, tan facades. It's also, when you come up the main street, it's palm tree lined. It's called Palm Drive. So there's like all these tons of like just palm trees lining the whole entryway, and then it frames this chapel as you come up. There's this manicured, huge oval lawn, and then this famous mosaic in the or fresco maybe in the chapel. And so it's incredibly beautiful. It's also imposing. It doesn't feel like a university. Also, you can it's the people that are there, mostly because of the area and what the university itself, are often doing well economically. So it feels it's beautiful and it feels rich. That's how it feels. Um, and
I was
I don't mean
about
that. I don't.
to
Yeah,
throw you some help. So it felt very, very like rich people out there.
yeah. And it's like, but I don't want to say it in a way that seems it's not meant to be denigrating. It's just like that's what. Just if you came and you never been, you have a sense of like people are doing well. Things are going well. And obviously, the reason I hesitated because that's not true for everyone, right? There are a number of students who come from they're first generation students. There's all kinds of students in the faculty too, but the feeling overall, like kind of the atmosphere feels rich. That's what it feels like. And when I came to visit for graduate school, like I found that off-putting. I
Mm.
didn't, I didn't feel deeply connected to that. And again, there were other reasons I didn't
Why do
come.
you think that is in a way?
Why
Because
was it off-putting?
that is, yeah, because that's very interesting because it's maybe another person who would desire to join that particular group would see this in a different light in a way. I'm trying
Oh,
to.
sure, I understand. Yeah, there are people who get into the program, and there's a version of how could I possibly say no to coming to Stanford, right? I mean, I think there's certainly some of that, and the prestige and the feeling of the campus adds to it instead of detracts. I get that. I mean, it just for me, it didn't feel that way because this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like it wasn't at that time compatible with my sense of myself, right? So I was curious and I craved intellectual engagement deeply, but the cultural distance between that place and other places with regard to me, like how far away I felt culturally from that place, um was bigger. There's a bigger gap between my sense of myself in the world, not my abilities, intellectual interests, but my sense of myself in the world. I was very discrepant from the world I perceived to be at Stanford at the time. And that was honestly like just uncomfortable. Like it just didn't feel good. It felt like I don't know how to at the time. Again, it's when I was just starting, I hadn't started yet graduate school. The distance to traverse culturally just seemed huge,
Mm.
and that was uncomfortable.
if on,
Um,
if on that day where you walked to the campus and where you felt that you would have seen a cool professor with a motorbicycle jacket come your way, put off his helmet, and it's you, and you had the opportunity to walk around with him a little
mm,
bit and give him some off-air advice of
mm,
what he's going to go through if he's gonna make that decision, but also what he's going to win. Like if
mm.
you have your arm around him, like it's a
Yeah.
maybe like a big brother, little brother kind of talk. Like, what would you give him?
I kind of did have that. So there was a professor at Stanford who was some version of that. Um, and I
Who was
still
he,
would have said,
if I may
huh?
ask? Who was he?
Um, Claude Steele.
Klaus Young. Okay.
Yeah. He was the person I would have worked with if I had gone, or one of the people, right? So he would have probably been my primary advisor if I had gone. And he was fantastic. And he still is. Like I still talk to him now. He's great. And by the way, I have an interview up on my podcast with him. You should check it out. He's incredible. He's working on a book. He's still really active and is incredible ideas. Anyway, so Claude Steele.
Claw
Um,
Steel.
Claude
Okay,
Steele,
we'll put
yeah.
it in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, yeah, you should definitely. People should check out the podcast, and then also get his books. I think his book is going to be incredible. He's still working on it. Um, I feel like I made the right decision. He he actually really almost persuaded me to change my mind, but I didn't. Um, and I feel like I made the right decision, is what I would say. Like it worked out in a way that I think it would have been harder to work out had I been at Stanford. But who knows? Maybe things would have been even better had I gone to Stanford. But um, I think from where I sit right now, it's hard to imagine how that would have been the case.
Okay, in that case, let me rephrase
Mm.
my attempt to get you out of your reserve in a way. If you would have advice for somebody who comes from a foreign world, maybe a
Yeah.
world where he feels that he is lesser than the world that he is about to enter, maybe somebody who applies and gets accepted to one of these schools, and he has nobody who encourages him or just helps him to keep his cool in regards to that adventure. How would you help that person in regards to like a token of wisdom that you could trust that person with?
Um, so by the way, I would just say like there was never a feeling of lesser. It was just a feeling of deeply different and discomfort. I would tell someone in that situation is what I've always told my graduate students. Like, one, the reason you go to an educational institution, so if we're talking about grad school, is to learn. So that you don't know now is not a problem. That is the appropriate state, right? And really, I think what I would say, and I think this is probably true for a lot of situations beyond academia. For better or worse, I've rarely seen someone fail because of lack of ability. Like maybe more, I don't know, in academia, maybe more people should fail for that reason. I don't know, but I've not seen people like, for example, it's really rare that I've seen anyone kicked out because they just didn't have the ability. What I mostly see is people unwilling to engage in the way you need to engage to be successful, to continue to persevere, to push through the discomfort, to make mistakes and try to your best to learn from them and keep moving forward. I think that is what I would say. That's what's necessary. Like the rest of it, you can learn along the way. And so mostly I would say, don't, if this is a place for you, in the sense that this is, I think opportunities are here for you to learn and grow, I wouldn't worry so much about, I probably wouldn't worry too much about the cultural distance that, and if the fear that, if that is causing you fear that you can make it, like, yeah, I think that most people have more potential and ability than they imagine. And if you find yourself in a place where you're capable of expressing that, there's a high likelihood that you'll be successful. That's what I would say. And if not, here's the other thing. And if not, who cares? Like, that's life. If not, if you're in a place where you feel deeply engaged and you're trying your best and you fail, like, yeah, that's not a bad, that's their worst outcomes.
What is your favorite failure story of yours? Maybe something where you tried really hard, push yourself to the limit, it didn't work out anyway, and later this very thing not working out for you turned out working out very much for you.
You know, it's funny. This is a, this is a question that people ask, not asking me that, but I just think people ask, and I never have a good answer. I feel like I fail all the time, and they don't they don't stand out to me. Like I don't have like a great failure story. Like, I mean, I have all kinds of like stories where things didn't work out, but I don't think any of them have the quality that people are looking for. I don't have like, I did this thing, it didn't work out, but later I learned, or um it's good that it didn't work out because of this. Like I don't have like a clear story like that. I mean, again, like I fail all the time. They just maybe I'm not good at learning lessons. I don't know what I don't know, or maybe I'm very good at selective memory. I don't know, like
Well, as an expert in identity, you know very well what references to pick for your sense of self. I would assume.
maybe, I mean, like there are times, like I guess what I would say about me is I like to try new things, and like everybody, I like to be good at them. I also sometimes have really high standards and I get frustrated. And yeah, like I feel like it's sometimes I push myself hard and then fail, and if I'm frustrated by it, but I don't think that in the life, in terms of the things that matter to me day to day, um maybe I just don't think in terms of like success and failure. I don't know, because I don't have a feeling of a deep failure that like really lingers or resonates for me. I don't not to say, again, not to say I haven't had those kind of failures. I just don't have anything that like I can look back to and like, wow, that really sucked. And if only blah blah blah. Like I don't have that kind of counterfactual thinking on some significant failure.
Well, selective memory might be your answer. There's a very funny commercial. Like I was a basketball player, and
Uh-huh.
there's one funny NBA commercial where a lot of the old legends like are interviewed at a porch party about all the shots they missed, and every single one of them told like couldn't remember how much games they lost. No, Jesus, like, huh? No, I don't remember that in a
I
way.
never I
Oh,
never
Scotty
lost that
Pippen
game.
shows us like, no, I never lost that game. That never happened.
Yeah.
I don't know where you heard that from. That was so funny because I felt there was a lot of wisdom, and it is just like, for example, my job in my private practice is often to help people establish a story for themselves that is empowering and useful. And one of parts of that is to help them to see like what the reference points are in their past, and maybe
Mhm.
pick different one, because it's so strange. Like sometimes we get our heart broken and we get caught up on that one girl who ran away, who we couldn't keep at our side, and
Yeah.
ignore that we maybe had like 100 like stories that told afterwards that were incongruent with the belief that nobody could ever love us, for example, like that. So
Uh-huh.
maybe that's a brilliant answer. However, to not leave you off the hook,
Okay.
any any story that comes to your mind where you mentioned the word perseverance, which is beautiful.
Mm.
Any story that comes to mind where you were short of giving up, like where you were really tested as a man in regards to the crisis that your personal journey through this world confronted you with? Like, what
Uh,
was your biggest test so far as a human being?
oh, so that's a deep question. Um, I did almost quit graduate school. Almost. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly true. I would say more. I seriously contemplated quitting, and honestly, I don't know if staying was like the. I can't tell if staying was the courageous or cowardly thing to do, but that's what I stayed. Um, but there was a point and I think this is common for people in PhD programs, at least the ones that I know. There's a point of crisis where I had completed the coursework, which you generally complete in the first, call it 2 or 3 years. And I was just looking ahead, and it was the first time I was really thinking about um, what would my life be in this if I continued down this path. And I was having a hard time conceiving of a life that would feel satisfying at that moment, um, where it wouldn't feel isolating and terrible. And given that I had committed so much to this path I was like I was probably fell into like a depression for a little bit. Um, and after I came out of that, kind of thinking about other things that I might do if I left. Um, but then I decided I didn't. Then I mean, obviously I didn't leave. Um, and I guess I would credit my advisor with helping me through that. But it's hard to me to point to the thing that led me to stay exactly. Like I still don't really know, but I know that yeah, I was just suffering for a period of time with where I was and where I might end up. Um, yeah, so I think that was, I mean, in terms of like a crisis point that was life defining in terms of on the other side, that's what I would point to. But I don't have any great insight into.
Where did you have this? Because like that's a question that I feel like everybody who is really devoted to his craft asks themselves. Because usually when it's in the office, it's late, there's nobody there. The sacrifices on your social front, you haven't seen your friends, like there's trouble in your relationship. If you still have one, there's no money. It's all these kind of things where you ask yourself, what the fuck am I doing here? It's
Yes.
those kind of moments, like if you haven't encountered them, then you're not all in with what you're doing. I feel, and I'm always interested that what people who don't give up in those kind of situations, not sure if it's a good thing to not give up, might also be insanity, but what they have in common in a way.
Yeah, I don't, so I think there's a version of just like not being beaten. Like that's the thing I have, but I think it's sometimes probably foolhardy, but and it's, I don't know if it's not giving up exactly. I think it's more like not being beaten. I don't want to feel like I couldn't do it, right? Which is different than choosing not to do it. There's probably some of that in the reason I would stay, and the reason I like when these things kind of happen in life, it really is tough, and it's not clear that whatever's on the other side is will compensate for what you're going through. Like it's not like you're not doing it because you're going to get something. It's not like I'm going to persevere because on the other side the reward is going to be worth it. There's no compensating for it on the other end. There's just the experience of going through it. That's all there is. Like, and if there's something over there and it doesn't make up for what that cost was. And I think it's, for me, when I have those experiences, it really is just like, this is what it really means to live. Like if you have the experience of caring deeply about a thing and struggling through it, like in some sense, that's a gift. It's like you're alive when you're doing it. Like it might not feel good, but you don't wake up in the morning wondering what there is to do. You might wake up wondering if you can do it, but you're not confused about what there is to do and what it means to you. Right. The question is just like, is it worth it? And I think when I make it through those things, I kind of get over, let go of the question, is it worth it? And just am engaging in what there is to be done in that moment. There's no it's not worth it. Like that's not like, it's just what you mean is like, I'm going to be rewarded for this. It's just the experience of it itself.
We've talked a lot about our identities and self. When those questions ensue out of adversity, who do you think is the one who is the author behind those questions? Because that's very fascinating to me. For example, is what kind of questions people ask themselves and where do they stem from? Because I, for example, if you are, just to give you my point, like if a person, for example, who is when I work with people who are very depressed, it always feels like while they are depressed, they are not really there. Like something else is talking to me, like something possessed them for the time being, and the color and the nature of the questions that they ask is not only of lesser quality but also of different motives in a way. How do you, as a social psychologist, an expert, like think about these kind of things in a way? Because it's how do you view the human condition in that regard? Are we one thing or are we many?
Oh, I think we're certainly many things. I mean, that is built into the way I see the world, in the sense that, again, like, we exist through social context, and as the context shifts, so do we. Like, we're not some stable core that the earth revolves around, and the social universe revolves around. We're like a part of the system itself. So as it shifts, so do we. So I think that we're there's multiple ways that we exist and possibilities. The question is, if the question is like, where do these questions come from? I don't know. It's like, to me, it's a strange and hard to describe alchemy of past experiences, current relationships, cultural context, and the complexity of it gives it the appearance of it emanating from nowhere. Meaning, like, because it's hard to predict, it seems like it's unique to that person, which it is, but it seems like it somehow springs forth from nowhere from that person. And that, I don't think is right. That, I think, is an illusion. And I think that illusion of springing forth from some inner core of the person is created by the complexity of forces that generate the behavior of the question. Because we can't understand how it came to be, we assume it's magic. And we ascribe that magic to individuals.
What is your take on Carl Jung and his beliefs, for example, that some of these voices, these parts of us, precede the point where we enter this world?
Sure, I buy that 100%. I think, but well, I shouldn't say that 100%. Here's what let me say it in a different way. We all enter a story already underway. Like, there's no, I said before, there's no blank slate, and I talked about it in terms of biology. There's also no blank slate, because the story of you exists before you're born. You don't come into the world new. You come into a world that's been created for you already. And I can, like, here's a concrete, simple way, like that, because that can sound mystical, and I don't mean it to. So when your mother is pregnant with you, or when people start to, even before that, when people start to anticipate the arrival of a child, stories are already being spun about that child, who they are, who they will be. There's already thoughts about how the people connected to the child will change. Like, so your mother, the person who's giving birth to you will go from being a woman to a mother, right? Like, that will change, and that mother will have a certain belief about who you will be and how they should interact with you. That, all those things will affect the world that you come into and be associated with you before you have any experience of yourself, before there is in some sense, a yourself. We don't come into a world that's new. We come into an existing world, and there's those things that are just concretely about you. But there's also, as an example, if, for me, I was born Black into a world that had all these pre-existing beliefs about what that meant, that weren't about me, didn't have anything to do with me, but it has everything to do with my experience. So we're not born into a world that's empty. And so, in that sense, the idea that there are stories that pre-exist our birth that affect who we are and who we can be, there's nothing mystical or magical about that. Of course, that's true.
Mm-hmm. one of the persons who is also a great promoter of Carl Jung's beliefs, I would say, is Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
If I would put you and Jordan Peterson in a room with some snacks and I lock the door and you can discuss without a microphone there, what do you feel would that conversation be like?
I don't know enough about him to say, honestly. Like the very little I know is that he attained prominence by having a playbook to engage with the world. Like beyond that, I don't know very much. Like he has some book, I don't know, was it 12 rules or 7 rules or 21 rules? I don't know, some number of rules. And the only thing I'll say about that is like I don't ascribe to that view. Like I don't, and one thing I say in I probably say some point in the book that I wrote that's just not yet published is there's no paint by numbers way of fixing your life. It just doesn't exist. So I'm typically against a set of rules for living or a simple set of rules for doing anything in particular. But beyond that, I have no idea because I don't know enough about him. I haven't studied him to say to understand
One
his
of the
positions.
points he very openly defends, for example, is taking the side of the individualist versus collectivist in a way. Like Jordan Peterson studied for years, for example, the Alexander Solzhenitsyn and communism and the psychological roots of group identity, and is a firm opposer to those beliefs. And he, for example, made the claim that we would talk about white privilege for a second, for example. Like he feels that white privilege, I think it's a quote, maybe I butchered a little bit, that the association of group guilt to an ethnicity is as racist as it comes. And how would you respond to that?
Oh, it's that particular thing. It's easy. I don't talk about white guilt. That's not relevant to me, but to deny the existence of white privilege is just like anti-empirical. Like it's just a description of the world. Like you can make, and if someone says like, if this is true, then you're saying something about white guilt. I say like, from my perspective, that is that person projecting their own concerns. Like what I would say is like, look, and I study that. Like I study how the psychological effect it has on people who identify as white. And what I would say is the idea that group identity is a problem. I don't know. Sure. Like I think tribalism is a huge problem, but to deny its existence is just silly. I mean, it exists in the world, right? Whether it should or not, we can have a conversation about that. But I don't think there's any human society that doesn't have group identities. And in fact, Jordan Peterson or anyone else, I assume, actually clings to those identities to make sense of themselves in the world. That's what, in part, why they exist. So this idea of pure individualism is a pipe dream. Like it's just not sensical. Like it just doesn't, that's just not humanity. I mean, we could say is it's a value that we should stress. And sure, we could have a conversation around that, but there's no denying the existence of group identity. Like that just seems foolhardy.
You made a video, I think we talked before about that, is where you, for example, presented some empirical research that, and please correct me if I'm butchering the studies here and steal away my question away, that one of the solutions you proposed was, for example, that there's a disadvantaged group or society for a way, that one of the ways in which we could correct that would not only to be to equal the opportunities, but also to put the people who are further ahead in the race back to the starting point in a way. And now you have to correct me in a way because I probably butchered. You still
Yeah.
remember
So
that video?
yeah.
Because
I don't know the video, but I know what you're talking about. So no, I don't think my point is that's what we should do. What I'm saying is people seem to be more comfortable with the idea of disadvantage than advantage. So if you tell someone, hey, this group has been historically been disadvantaged, people typically, and like in the stuff that I've done, like that doesn't elicit the same kind of response as telling someone people in this other group have been historically advantaged. Like that elicits a stronger response. And typically I would say more discomfort. And the point I make is that those two things are in some sense equivalent. They're the flip side of the same coin, right? If you say there's um, inequity, you mean relative difference, and you can't have disadvantage without having advantage. And so when we want to correct things, people feel much more comfortable saying, like, let's correct disadvantage by lifting people up than they feel comfortable saying, let's address advantage by bringing people down. And I get why, like when you hear it that way, it's like, of course, we just want to lift people up. That sounds great. The problem is once you actually start to make these changes, correcting disadvantage for a lot of people feels like taking something away from someone else. So even though like psychologically the experience of hearing that language, disadvantage and advantage, that those two things are, the experiences are separable. Psychologically, people can distinguish between disadvantage and advantage even when they're describing the same thing. Once you start looking at shifts in systems and what people have access to, people seem to treat the correction for inequity as if you're taking something from the advantage group. Like that, I mean, in the real world, I think that's how it's experienced. I mean, in my research, you can focus people on just how the disadvantaged group is becoming better off, and they're fine with that. If you highlight the cost to the advantage group, they tend to be less comfortable with it. And then, by the way, this is awful. This is really kind of complicated, and we can get, you can cut this out if you want, but the only, what I should say this, I should say it a little bit differently. In the research, what happens really is people can distinguish between advantage and disadvantage. If you tell someone a group is disadvantaged, they want to lift that group up. If you convince people that a group is advantaged, they want to take away from the advantaged group. That's really what happens in the studies.
Yeah, that was, I find that very interesting because it's because that is happening very much in our world right now. I feel is where people right now, if they, or maybe I go back a question, who decides what disadvantages to focus on? Because you know what I mean? Because it's, for example, imagine now we would live in the same country. Like it would be very convenient for you to focus on the one disadvantage that favors you, but ignore all the disadvantages that could, for example, favor me in a way. You know what I mean? Because it's like, imagine, for example, we are I was traveling the world, and I've been to many communist countries. And one of the things that I found is that there's from what I could see, is a commonality in regards to the way of thinking that I saw in that video. There was the identification of a group who got there unfairly, so to say. Let's say the rich bourgeoisie, like they are evil in a way. And the virtuous poor, like, have the right to even the scale a little bit and take what they have and give it to what they have in a way. But what is your take on that in regards to the element of who makes these kinds of decisions in a way?
So I need to separate things. Like, so first, what I would say is, like, from my perspective, there's not like an evil rich and virtuous poor, where, like, you know, terrible white folks and like virtuous people of color. Like, that's not how I see it. What I would say, and what I do say is, like, we all exist in the system. And when the system is inequitable, unfair, that's problematic for everyone in the system, and that everyone in that system should care about resolving that. So that's the first thing. Like, that's my view. Like, who gets to say what matters, what's disadvantage and what's advantage? In reality, it's usually people with political power or voice, right? So I think that people are growing uncomfortable with the shift in voice or power associated, for example, with social media. Like, so you have a lot of people concerned about like the Twitter mob, for example, or you know, the woke crowd. And I get that. I don't deny it. Like, I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not siding with anyone in this. But what I will say though is that always existed. It's just that the people with power were the ones who had the voice, right? Like, it's not as if this is a new phenomenon. It's just that it's the people who before didn't have much power are now making use of tools that grant them more power. And I don't know that they're better. I'll just be clear about that. Like, I think before, when that power was more circumscribed to a smaller set of people, I don't think that was great. And I don't know that it's necessarily better now that more people have that power. But the idea that somehow there's been some fundamental shift, and now people are unreasonable where before everything was reasonable and fair, that's silly to me. And so who gets to decide there's a problem? I think there's a constant battle over any society's narrative, like who's virtuous and who's not, who deserves more and who deserves less. I mean, I think there's a constant struggle in society over those categories and labels. I don't have a sense of like who should be able to describe it, but I just think that's how it actually is.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I found very interesting was that in those countries that I've been to, like Cambodia, for example, like where like it was very touching for me to stand in front of piles of skulls from people who died because people externally try to act out some of the ideas to its extreme that I felt was part of that video that I saw from you. Like that was one of the things when I see like that was interesting to me in a way, because one of the things that I find so fascinating about the Western society is that where there's more freedom, where these things take care of themselves, the more wealth there is, and the more people try to install new systems in a way, it feels like it goes almost always catastrophically wrong to the degree where you will have millions of dead people. Like that's just one of the things that I've learned in a way. Like, and I'm German. Like there has been, for example, like as a German person, if that's part of my identity, like 73 years ago in a way, like there was one group who were, for example, both white, and they felt like this group acquired the riches that they have by unjust means, and they took it from them. And the consequence was that one of the most heinous crimes in human history occurred, which is why I'm very sensitive to ideas of that. Not
so
to
let me
any of your thoughts into that group, of course.
So let me just say, like, what if you had someone who was trying to create a new social system and millions of people were killed, but the person trying to create the social system won? What would that look like?
Can you phrase that again?
Yeah. So like you gave the example of like Germany. What I'm saying is, what if Germany had won? What would the world look like? And what I'm saying is, like, what we do is we have a problem. Why we look at the places where people tried to remake the systems and failed, and many people were killed, and it looks like it was for nothing, and we demonize those people. In the United States, how many people died in the transatlantic slave trade? How many people of the natives people here were killed? And so to say, like, well, it works out and is safe and calm when, you know, we value the individual, maybe when people successfully change the regime and millions of people die, we don't examine those situations in the same way, is what I'm saying.
Interesting. Okay, I get it. Not sure I would use the word successful in a way though.
But
Okay,
I mean, I
but
guess I'm saying successful in the
can.
sense that, like, we were saying that, like, you pointed to, like, the West and said,
The
like,
system persevered in a way. Okay,
yeah, uh-huh.
I get it. I get it. Huh. I have a strange question for you. Very strange. One of the points that I found very interesting is again from that Peterson made that I wanted to have your take on, was the idea that the driving, motivating selves that inherits people who do such heinous crimes is the same in a way. Like one of the points he made in an interview recently that I wanted to have your take on was that, for example, resentful people who take action upon their belief of correcting the world according to their victim's mentality and punishing the people who do these kind of things are guided by the same motivational forces, and that these, he called it the spirit of Cain, which I found very very interesting from the Bible in a way. I wanted to have your take as a social psychologist and worldly experts in regards to the idea that some of these systems that did what they did were indeed driven by the same driving forces that ensued from the same self. Nobody will probably understand this question. Maybe you can help me with this though.
I think it's deeper than that. I think that's selective. So what I would say is, if the question is, does resentment over perceived inequity, can that, when paired with power, drive terrible outcomes in a society, right? So, I mean, if people are aggrieved and upset because they feel like they've been cheated or been treated unfairly, and you give those people significant power, what are they likely to do? And is that what's driving a lot of the things that you're discussing historically? Sure. I think that that's certainly possible, but I would also say that the same is true for entitlement. So people who feel entitled to what they have when given great power will do heinous things to continue to oppress other people and feel righteous while doing it. So that's what I mean. That story is that he's telling, I don't know that I would necessarily disagree, but it's incomplete. Right.
Okay.
And I think that people in power currently tell selective stories. Right. And that's and because everyone does. Like, people tell stories so they continue to feel virtuous in the position they occupy.
Yeah.
That's true at the top and true at the bottom.
One of the things that I found very interesting is what happens when you change the story that a person has that governs them. Mm-hmm. Like it's for example, like when I've worked with narcissistic people in the past who had a non-negotiated sense of who they were, and they were challenged with the idea that they are not as virtuous as they pretend to be. That was an adventure that happened afterwards in a way. And another hot topic that I wanted to have your take on in regards to identity, Brian, is there's a huge debate going on in the West right now in regards to gender identity. And I know that you've thought about this as well, particularly in regards to man and woman switching their gender and not integrating the element that these things are maybe not up for discussion in a way. Like, as a social psychologist watching that, what's your take on all
this? So first, I would make a distinction between gender and sex. And this, I'm going to give like the simplest version. So people who study this give much more nuanced versions of the distinction I'm going to give, but I think it's this, at least a rudimentary distinction, is useful and necessary. So sex, let's call sex biological, right? So you're born with some biology, right? You have some kind of pairing of X and Y, or some combination of X and Y chromosomes that dictate some things about you physically. Let's call that sex. Gender is different. Gender is a social construction. So when I say gender, what I mean is the rights and responsibilities that we ascribe to a gender category. And let's simplify and just say they're men and women. So they're men and women, and they're males and females. Let's just stick with that for a second. Gender is a social identity, meaning we give it to people or we don't in interactions. And what does that mean? That means we have certain expectations of people that we ascribed the social identity of women to. Same with men. And if they live up to those things, great. And if they don't, we kind of punish them. I think this is like a social thing. So what I would say is so now with those things in hand, here's what I would say. I think people can be whatever gender other people allow them to be. That you can't. Here's the, and this is enough. There's something in there for everybody to love, and there's something in there for everybody to hate. So
it's one of those questions where you have to pause a moment and say, like, what did he say precisely? Elaborate, please.
Yes. That you can't be a social identity by yourself. Like that is, I mean, that should be obvious. That's just definitional, right? There's nothing interesting in that. It's just making a point. So what I mean by that is, I can't you look at me, I can't just say I'm a man or woman and be that thing. I can ask you in a way to engage with me as a man. And in that interaction, if you say yes, and I see myself as a man, you see me as a man, then I'm a man in that situation. In terms of biologically, nothing has to change for me to be a woman. But for me to be a woman, what has to happen is I have to see myself as a woman, and you have to engage with me as a woman. Then I am a woman, because social identities aren't dictated by biology, right? They are affected by biology for sure, but they aren't dictated by biology. And so I think people can be whatever gender other people allow them to be. I think the reason this is really touchy and hot is because you have, and I have, and we all have an understanding of the world in our minds and a belief about people and how people should be and what people are. And we form our relationships based on those beliefs. So you have a mother and a father, maybe your parents, either still alive or not. You have brothers and sisters, romantic partners, all these identities all these relationships in your life. And for many people, gender is a central component to making sense of themselves in those relationships. Meaning, like, if I'm in a romantic relationship with a woman, I see myself in one way, and the world sees me one way. If I'm in a romantic relationship with a man, people see me differently. And I understand that. And I engage with the world in that way. Now, if I come along and challenge the way you understand gender, and I challenge it simply by making requests for me, like, I want you to see me. I present as a man. I think of myself as a man in my life. Almost everyone interacts with me as a man. If I, in this interaction, said, like, no, I'm a she, and I'm asking you to engage with me as a woman, that's not just, people talk about that as if that request is just for me, about me. But when I do that in an interaction with you, Daniel, for you to accept that, in some sense, challenges other relationships in your life that have nothing to do with me, potentially, because it challenges your concept of gender itself. And if you have relationships that are based on that understanding of gender, and now I'm challenging that understanding of gender, that becomes a deeper issue, right? Like, my personal need is asking you to, in some sense, shift your understanding of the world you live in, which also challenges, like, where you exist in your relationships. And that, I think, is why people are super sensitive to it. It's not people treat it as like a personal thing, but the reality is it's like deeply political because it shifts the way we understand ourselves in the world.
One of the things that, first of all, thank you for sharing that I found very interesting in regards to conducting the interview with you today was that I noticed within me for the first time in my life while writing and talking a little censor. Careful what you say. That was
With me?
Yes, because so far, like I focus for most of my interviews on the individual in front of us, but you happen to be an expert like in many topics that are hot in the world right now. And what this reminded me of was that in regards to the topic that for right now we discussed, that I thought, okay, maybe it is hot because the people in charge of these companies like have a certain belief systems that they do not like to challenge in a way. And I'm of the same opinion of yours, is that these kind of things need to be discussed and should always be allowed to discuss. And but this kind of feeling that we had walking on eggshells reminded me so much of working or being connected with narcissists in a way where you had to be super careful of what you say to not threaten that they lash out on you in a way. So what's your take on people who do not want to partake in the discussion of their identities, but just decide these things for themselves in a way?
I mean, I'm sympathetic in the sense that I think it's really hard to have your sense of self, your sense of your place in the world challenged. Like it's just a tough thing, and it's deeply uncomfortable and frightening. And I do understand that. So I try to be sensitive to that, because I think for some people the worldview that I present is, I think sometimes I think it's obvious. Like, what is there to talk about? All this is so clearly just how the world is. Like, I don't even know that I'm saying anything that needs to be said out loud. Sometimes I feel that way. And then other times I can see people being deeply, deeply challenged by the world that I'm spinning for them. Like the world I'm presenting to them as the world they live in. Like it clearly doesn't feel good. And I try to be, when I remember that people have that experience sometimes, sympathetic to that. And it's like I don't feel judgment of those people at all. But sometimes I lose sight of the fact that how disconcerting what I'm saying can be if it feels novel to you. I just forget that people can have that reaction to it. I think.
Sorry to interrupt.
Hmm.
Like, of course, people like that react when their belief systems are attacked, right? Are you always like, how do you deal with this if somebody, for example, like that was very interesting. Like I found it very interesting that when we started talking that we had some different views on some topics, but how do you preserve loyalty to what makes sense to you while also being open to the idea of, maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe that's not the end of the world?
Because I think I don't have that many commitments really. I mean, I'm pretty like some things I'm pretty certain of, but I don't feel attached to them as so much like something that I discovered. I'm attached to it in a way I'm attached to the belief that the sun is going to rise, in the east in the morning. Like, it would be pretty damn shocking if that didn't happen, but I don't feel defensive about it. Like, I just feel like this is the nature of the world. So there's some things that I say that to me I'm like, I don't need to be there's nothing to be defensive about, because it's not, I don't experience it as a belief unique to me. I just experience it as like, I don't know what to tell you. That's how the world is. You can like it or not like it. And if I'm wrong, I could be wrong, but it just never even occurs to me.
Mm-hmm. if you may I ask you another question, even though I interrupted you before?
Yeah.
The world is in a very strange place because we use a handful of apps for our communication, for the presentation of our identities. This was never the case in human history, and it's also for the first time I feel that maybe it's not the first time, maybe that's a bad sentence to begin with. What's your, like, if you had a message for these tech kings that reign right now, to get your advice in regards to the monitoring of identity and communication and free speech and all of that, like what would you, for example, tell, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg is the owner of Meta and Instagram and WhatsApp and all these kind of things that we use to talk in a way, and of course, like, if something is discussed that doesn't align with the belief systems of that company, they will react to it. Like, what message would you have to somebody like Mark Zuckerberg in regards to the architecture of like a communication space that works for the ennoblement of all of us and not to the domination of whatever they feel is right in regards to the world?
I don't know. I don't think I have. I don't know. Okay, I'll say something. I don't know if I have anything really great to say to a Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, what I would highlight is the idea that technology is only a conduit as opposed to also a shaper of what's possible in interactions is misguided. And as something that shapes interactions, it also is shaping what it's possible for people to be. And I think that sometimes the tech companies lose sight of that there's not sufficient responsibility. Like, free speech is not sufficient. Like, that's just not a sufficient value to dictate how these things should operate from my perspective. To me, in some sense, that's an abdication of responsibility if you are shaping how humans interact with each other, and then therefore shaping what humans can be, to say free speech as like the only lodestar is irresponsible, is what I would say. And then and I would just point out that I recognize they are moving away from that. They're trying to monitor content, and this is coming up now, or was a big deal with Twitter, right? How much moderation, rather, of content should there be? And I would say, like, I do understand. I am sympathetic that it's not an easy problem to solve, right? So it's not as if I'm saying here's the thing to do. Like, that's why I don't have that much to say. I don't have an answer for how to deal with it, but I think it's irresponsible not to understand that when you shape the way human beings can interact, you're shaping what it's possible for them to be, and that requires deep engagement with, I think, the underlying psychology of humanity. And I think for a long time, tech companies didn't take that seriously. They had some, like, I don't know, tech focused utopia in mind, that if you let people interact and you lower frictions to interaction, the world was just going to become a better place. And that's simplistic. It's just not. I think that's just not true.
What was your reaction when, as a European, it was very interesting to me when, because you never take these things seriously, but when I started to take this seriously, that these tech companies are in charge of the psychological climate of the world, was when Donald Trump was removed from Twitter. That was strange to me. The idea that you can, even if somebody was the president, that there's like a superior force above that who can send him to his room, basically. What was that for you like to see that?
I don't think that was that novel to me. I mean, before it was the internet, it was like people who ran newspapers or radio stations. Like, to the ability to control how humans connect and interact across space and time has always, at least since, and that's something I talk about in the book, at least since the invention of paper, has been a part of how our societies function and are structured, and a source of incredible power. Right? I think people lose sight of the magic of being able to engage with other human beings across vast distances and even across time. Like that is not, for most of human history, that did not exist. I think that people just simply don't understand the magnitude of what that allows and how it shapes how we engage and interact. So, for example, I'll just do this briefly. There's a book called Imagined Communities, where it's the basic argument is that nation states exist in large part because of the printing press, right? That it's an evolution of communication, the sense of the creation of a shared language where, for example, you're German, that there used to be, and there probably still are, innumerable dialects, tons of dialects spoken in what is now considered Germany, and High German now has become German, but that was the argument is that is in part necessary to coalesce around printing presses so people could sell books. And that created a sense of nation when people understood they were all experiencing history at the same time in the same way, that created a connection. And that connection was the birth, in some sense, or the kernel that led to the birth of the idea of a nation state. All that flows from the idea of how we communicate and what we know and who we know it with. And so I don't think the idea that current social media is affecting how we interact and how the world is shaped in our politics, there's nothing new about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we go over, or maybe we go there, tell us what your new book is going to be about. And maybe also, I feel that there's the content, the story of a book, but there's also a story behind why a book exists. And I think both always have a special place, both in the heart of the author and in the heart of the persons who will read these thoughts of yours.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation is really some ways tied to it's actually tied to both the book and to some extent the podcast, because I do examine some of these issues in the podcast. The book is called Selfless, the Social Creation of You. And the basic argument is that human beings have at least two, not only, but at least two existential motives. One is the need for structure, the desire for the world to make sense, for you to exist in the world in a sensible way, to get up and be like, okay, this is how the world works, and have that comfort. And the other is a desire for the feeling of freedom, the feeling that like you can shape the world, that your decisions matter, and that those two things actually are in tension, that they really don't they don't or can't coexist comfortably. So that's a big part of it. And what I, in essence, say is people's sense that they want freedom is overstated. That the reality is people are constantly, the feeling of freedom is the idea that we are free and that we want freedom is overblown, and that people constantly engage in behaviors, and humanity engages in behaviors and engages in such a way that highlight the need for structure. And the structure that I focus on most is the self. I basically say that your self is a social structure that is constructed in the relationships you have, interactions you have, the culture you exist in. That is the ingredients that give rise to the self. And so it's really an I don't know, an argument against, but you started off asking me, is there a core? Like in this book, I'm like, no, there's no core you. So that's kind of the book. I think it started off mostly because I was really interested in, that the tension between a desire for freedom and a need for structure, and how that plays out across anything that involves human beings. That you see it everywhere. You see it at the level of the individual, you see it at the level of the group, you see it at the level of the nation state, or any, at any, there's no level of human engagement in which you don't see these things kind of playing out. It's my argument.
Do you believe in, if I may ask, in God, Brian?
I would say mostly I'm agnostic, but I'm agnostic, and depending on the question, atheist. It depends on what people mean. Do I have an image of? Do I believe in a human-like entity that is omnipotent and omniscient? No, I don't. I'm atheist in that regard. If the question is, do I believe in something that is currently beyond my comprehension, a structure that's like at a level that is unknowable by me or maybe by humanity, that I'm agnostic. Maybe.
Let's talk about the future before I sadly have to let you go, even though we can, of course, go on for many more hours if it's up to me. In my last interview, I haven't published it, I had the privilege to talk to another Stanford alumni, Dr. Paul Conti, one of the world leading trauma experts. And in our long conversation, one of the things we talked about was the state of America in regards to the potential reconciliation of the of racism in regards to the wounds that occurred. And since we talked about trauma so much, like I think I had the idea that like America has these traumatic events that happen to its inhabitants, and that will go on as long until the right lessons are learned, right modifications are made in a way. What is your personal take on what your nation needs in order to heal from the wounds of your past?
I don't know. First, it would just be a recognition of the depth of those wounds. Like, I just think it's hard for people to actually accept. Well, for some people to accept the degree to which the history of this country is stained and still tainted by the sins of like of racism. I think that people haven't, like not everyone, but a large percentage of people haven't really come to terms with that. I think it's tough to do in an environment when people are willing to take advantage of people's fears and grievances for political gain. I just think it's hard. And I think that in my mind, this is where I'm a little bit pessimistic, because I think there's always opportunists, right? And when people are made uncomfortable, there's an opportunity presented and to offer something that makes them feel better. And when you're talking about grappling with the history of the nation and the negative features of the nation, there are going to be people who identify strongly with the nation who are deeply uncomfortable with that. And that's always going to provide opportunity for someone to take advantage of. And so I just think it's hard. So it's for that reason, I'm like, I don't know what it will take. I truly don't. There's a constant push and pull politically about on the narrative, right? What's right and what's wrong? What does it mean to be virtuous or not? What's acceptable? What isn't? And I think people like to believe it's all going in one direction, like getting better. And really, I think of it as more cyclical than that. So I would say I hope I'm wrong on that. I hope there's like we get to a point where it's like a straight upward trajectory towards what I think people could at least come to understand as a more just society. But I don't know that I think that's how things work.
Do you think human nature will eventually triumph over its priceless. You would think we will have a happy end.
How about I think we'll have an ending?
You think so?
I think I don't, yeah, eventually, like I think everything ends. That's my assumption, right? I don't I'm not like I'm not I don't feel like what I'm saying is not like, oh, in the next whatever, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, human beings won't exist. But I think we'd have to exist tens of thousands more years to, I believe, transcend many of the features of our current humanity that hold us back.
Maybe this is a good way to fade out from this very wild and unstructured interview that I burdened you with, Brian.
It was fun. I hope my answers were useful, because I feel like they've been at a high. We've talked at a very high level.
Oh, to be honest, I never have any expectations. I'm very grateful that you understood some of the mumbling that I threw in your way, and that you saved me with your sophisticated answers. And my whole intention for this interview was just to learn who you are in what limited space we have, and hopefully make people think about who they are and who they want to be, similar as you discovered in your time at university. I think that would be a great blessing for the many people who will listen to this. We just talked about the future of humanity. If nothing else, but this interview would survive the test of time, like what would be like a couple of pearls of wisdom that you would put in a time capsule for future generations to listen to, if this would be your only chance of conveying either advice or stories or maybe even warnings to them?
I don't know. I think I would say something like, human beings, at least right now, are who we're with. And so have to be wary about how we shape who people can be around and with. That, I mean, I just, what I want to say is some version of human beings are incredibly flexible and have vast amounts of potential and possibility, and that the way we allow people to connect is what defines who they become.
Where can people find you, Brian?
You can find me on my webpage. So I have a website called KNOW, What You See, .com. And that's the name of the podcast as well. And that's where I keep up to date things that I'm doing. The podcast will be up there. There'll be information about the book up there. You can find connections to things I've written up there as well. So that's probably the easiest way to find me.
If some of your students would listen to this, and you would have a special Easter egg of a homework assignment for them that would help them to become a better person, what kind of ordeal would you send their way? And then we are good with this podcast, I feel. And of course, with students, I not just mean the people who are in your classroom, but I feel I'm one of your students. The people who will listen to this podcast are one of your students. The people who will read your book, the people who will read your podcast, they're all people who trusted you with a position that they can learn something from you. What's something you would give them in order to be a better person, like a homework assignment?
Look around and find yourself.
Love it. Okay. Brian, it was an honor to learn more about you. I hope we can do this at some point again in the future. Thank you so much for taking your time. And yeah, have a great day and enjoy your time in Stanford while you're there.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Daniel. It was great to talk to you. It was really fun.
Thank you everybody for listening. I know this was a very long interview, but I've come to learn that the more time I have with extraordinary people like Brian, the more opportunities you have to snatch pearls of wisdom for them. So I will preserve this format and hope to bring you great guests like the one today in the future again. Thank you for listening. See you soon.